The weight wasn't just in the bags of groceries I carried up the steps of my parents' two-story house in upstate New York. It was in the silence of the phone calls, the missed holidays, the birthdays celebrated without us. It was in the promise I'd made years ago, a promise to be here, to be present, to be the one my family could count on when no one else would. And now, at 60 years old, I was living that promise every single day. My name is Marcus. I'm not a doctor, not a lawyer, not a CEO. For the past decade, I've been a son, a full-time, round-the-clock son. My siblings, Sarah and David, have their lives, their kids, their careers, their vacations to places I only see on postcards. They call on Sundays sometimes. They ask about Mom and Dad in the same detached tone they use to ask about the weather. How are things, they'll say, not how are you, but how are things, as if our lives were a business report they were briefly reviewing. My mother, Eleanor, was the matriarch, a force of nature who built a successful real estate empire from the ground up. She was sharp, decisive, and had a presence that could fill a room. But the years had taken their toll. The sharpness was still there, but it was now clouded by the fog of Alzheimer's. My father, Richard, a kind and gentle man, had his own health struggles. A series of small strokes had left him frail, his once booming voice reduced to a soft whisper. The house itself felt like a living archive of our lives. The faded floral wallpaper in the living room, the scent of my mother's favorite lavender air freshener, the worn grooves in the mahogany railing from 1,000 hands. I walked through these rooms every day, a ghost in my own memories. My younger self, the boy who dreamed of traveling the world, felt like a stranger here. This morning the air was crisp, carrying the scent of damp earth and distant wood smoke. Fall was setting in, and the trees were beginning to turn. A beautiful, melancholic transformation. I was in the kitchen preparing my parents' breakfast, a routine as ingrained in me as breathing. Oatmeal for Dad, soft scrambled eggs for Mom. I had to mash the eggs just right, a texture she preferred. Small details, a lifetime of small details. Just as I was serving the eggs, my phone buzzed. It was Sarah. Her calls were usually a precursor to some request. "Marcus, how's Mom's new nurse? Is she good with her medication?" Always the logistics, never the heart. "She's fine, Sarah," I said, my voice tired. "She's very professional." "Good. Listen, I was thinking about the holidays. We might not be able to make it this year. The kids have a big school trip." Her voice trailed off, the excuse hanging in the air like a flimsy piece of paper. I didn't argue. I didn't get angry. The well of my frustration had run dry years ago. "All right, Sarah. We understand." "Great. And how's Dad holding up?" "He's okay, a little weaker, but he's here." "Good, good. Well, I have to go. Give them my love, okay?" "I will." I hung up, the words feeling empty. Their love was a remote concept, a verbal courtesy, not an action. Later that day, I sat with my father on the porch. The sun was warm on our faces. He wasn't much for conversation anymore, but he held my hand, and sometimes that was enough. He looked at me, his eyes clear for a moment. "You're a good son, Marcus," he whispered. My throat tightened. "I'm just doing what's right, Dad. Your mother, she knows what you've given up." I squeezed his hand. "It wasn't a sacrifice, Dad. It was a choice." But it was a sacrifice. Every cancelled date, every dream deferred, every opportunity I let slip away. For years, I told myself it was worth it. I was doing the right thing. I was a good son. But deep down, a quiet, bitter voice whispered, "What about you? When does your life begin?" The question was a constant companion, a nagging thought that gnawed at the edges of my contentment. My friends were retired, traveling the country in RVs or doting on their grandchildren. I was an aging man in a house full of memories and responsibilities. The end came suddenly, and yet not unexpectedly. My mother passed away peacefully in her sleep a week later. She was lucid for a brief moment the night before, a flicker of her old self. She had looked at me, a soft, sad smile on her face. "Marcus," she had said, her voice stronger than it had been in years, "thank you for everything." I held her hand until the morning light, her last words a fragile gift I would cherish forever. The funeral was a blur of black suits and hushed condolences. Sarah and David flew in, their presence feeling like a performance. They spoke of my mother's legacy, her strength, her business acumen. They spoke of her as a legend, a distant memory, not the woman who had spent her last years needing help to tie her shoes. After the funeral, as the last of the mourners left, the three of us were left alone in the living room. The silence was heavy, punctuated by the ticking of the grandfather clock. "We need to talk," Sarah said, her voice sharp and businesslike, "about the estate." "What about it?" I asked, my mind still on my mother, not on money. "The will," David interjected, his gaze avoiding mine. "Mom had everything prepared. We need to schedule a meeting with the lawyer." "I know," I said. "We can do that next week." "No, we need to do it now," Sarah insisted. "We have to be on a flight back tomorrow. Besides, you're not going anywhere." The last words hung in the air, a subtle sting. They were a reminder of my life, a cage of my own making, or so it seemed. I looked at their faces, faces that were once so familiar, now etched with a cold, calculating greed. This wasn't about our mother's memory. This was about the division of her fortune. And for the first time, I felt a chilling sense of foreboding. The weight I'd been carrying all these years was about to get a lot heavier. The lawyer's office was on the 30th floor of a glass and steel skyscraper in downtown Albany, a stark contrast to the old-world charm of our family home. The panoramic view of the city felt immense, a world of ambition and commerce that I'd kept at arm's length for so long. The air was sterile, the silence broken only by the hum of the air conditioning. Sarah and David sat opposite me, their bodies rigid, their faces masks of strained politeness. Mr. Harrison, a man with a shock of white hair and a kind, weary face, cleared his throat. He had been my mother's legal counsel for decades, and his presence brought a small, fleeting comfort. He opened a manila folder, his movements slow and deliberate. "As you know," he began, his voice low and formal, "your mother, Eleanor Vance, made her final wishes clear. She was a meticulous woman, and she wanted to ensure her estate was handled exactly as she intended." Sarah leaned forward, her eyes fixed on the folder. "Can we just get to the point, Mr. Harrison? We have flights to catch." Mr. Harrison gave her a measured look. "Patience, Sarah. This is a matter of great importance." He looked at me, a silent message of sympathy in his eyes. He knew. He had seen me in this office before, handling my mother's business affairs, her medical directives, the small details that Sarah and David never had time for. He began to read from the will, his voice a steady, rhythmic drone. The opening clauses were predictable: distribution of a few personal items, sentimental trinkets, and some charitable donations. Then he got to the main body, the part we were all waiting for. "To my daughter, Sarah Vance, I leave the summer cottage in the Adirondacks and a trust fund of $500,000. Sarah's mouth twitched. The cottage was a beautiful property, but she had always wanted the apartment building in Manhattan. The look on her face was a mixture of disappointment and veiled calculation. "To my son, David Vance, I leave the portfolio of commercial properties in Syracuse and a trust fund of $500,000. David nodded, a small, tight smile on his face. The Syracuse properties were a good investment, but he too had a hunger for more. Then came my turn. Mr. Harrison paused, looking directly at me. "And to my son, Marcus Vance," he read, his voice gaining a new, somber weight. "For his unwavering love and sacrifice, for his tireless dedication to my and his father's care in our final years, I leave the main family home, the business headquarters building in downtown Albany, all remaining real estate holdings, and the majority of my liquid assets, amounting to an estimated value of—" He read a number that made the room fall into a deafening silence. It was a staggering sum, far more than the combined total of what Sarah and David had received. It was a number that represented not just a fortune, but my mother's validation. A thank you note, written in millions. Sarah gasped. David's face turned a shade of crimson. They looked at each other, then at me, their eyes wide with disbelief, then a growing, cold fury. "What?" Sarah finally said, her voice a low growl. "That's impossible." "The will is very clear, Sarah," Mr. Harrison said calmly. Your mother stated that Marcus's devotion and care were an incalculable asset to the family, and this was her way of ensuring he was compensated for his years of service. David slammed his hand on the table. Compensated? He was a caretaker. He wasn't working, he wasn't building a business, he was just there. He was our mother's primary caregiver, Mr. Harrison corrected him, his tone firm. A role you both, by your own admission, were unable to fill. This is what she wanted. This is insane, Sarah spat, her composure completely gone. He was a kept man, living in the house, a glorified servant, and now he gets everything? No, this is undue influence. He must have manipulated her. She had Alzheimer's, for God's sake. My blood ran cold. The words hit me like a physical blow. Caretaker, servant, manipulated. The years of devotion, of sleepless nights, of sacrificed dreams, were reduced to this, a cold, calculated accusation of opportunism. I stood up, my hands trembling. How dare you? How dare you say that after all I've done? What have you done, Marcus? David sneered, a cruel glint in his eye. You haven't had a real job in 10 years. You lived off her money, and now you want to take it all? This isn't fair, this isn't right. I was here, tis, I shouted, the dam of my suppressed emotions finally breaking. When you were busy with your careers and your families, I was here. I was the one who held her hand when she was scared. I was the one who fed her, bathed her, and sat with her through the night. Where were you? Where were you when she needed you the most? We paid for the nurses, Sarah shot back, her voice venomous. We paid for the medical bills. We did our part. You wrote a check, I roared. That's not a part, that's a transaction. This wasn't a business deal for me, Sarah. This was our mother, my mother. Mr. Harrison raised a hand, his face pale. This is not the time for this. The will has been read. If you wish to contest it, you have every legal right to do so. However, I can assure you the document is sound, and there is an extensive paper trail documenting Mrs. Vance's mental state when she signed it. She was of sound mind, and her intentions are clear. Sarah and David exchanged a look. The fury in their eyes had been replaced by a chilling determination. I knew in that moment what they were going to do. They weren't just going to contest the will, they were going to fight me. They were going to try to prove that I was a fraud, a manipulator, a leech who had taken advantage of our mother. We'll see about that, David said, his voice dangerously low. We will not let this stand. I looked at them, my heart sinking. This wasn't about the money anymore. It was about their perception of me, about their resentment, about the guilt they had been carrying for years, now festering into a monstrous lie. They were willing to burn everything down to avoid looking at their own neglect, and I, the loyal son, the caretaker, was now their enemy. The battlefield was set. The war had just begun. The following days were a whirlwind of legal jargon and emotional chaos. My phone buzzed constantly with calls from Mr. Harrison, followed by a torrent of angry accusatory texts from Sarah and David. The messages were a blend of threats and veiled insults, each one a stab to the years of service I had given. You're a disgrace, one text from Sarah read. This will be a public embarrassment for you, Marcus. David's messages were more direct, more hostile. You think you can just walk away with everything? Think again. We're hiring the best lawyers money can buy. We'll prove you manipulated Mom in her vulnerable state. Their words stung, but I knew their accusations were baseless. I had never pressured my mother about her will. In fact, the topic of money had always been a source of discomfort for me. I had simply done my duty, day in and day out, not for a reward, but for love. Mr. Harrison, however, was not concerned. Marcus, you have nothing to worry about, he reassured me over the phone. The will is ironclad. We have a mountain of evidence. I had your mother's mental state assessed by multiple doctors, precisely because she anticipated this. She was of sound mind when she signed it. Your siblings are grasping at straws. But the legal battle wasn't the only thing at stake. The emotional toll was immense. The house, once a sanctuary of quiet memories, now felt like a haunted space. Every room was a reminder of my mother's presence, and her absence was a physical ache. I found myself wandering through the halls, looking at her favorite armchair, her knitting needles still in a basket by the fireplace, her scent on a scarf she'd left on the coat rack. The grief was a fresh wound, and now my siblings were pouring salt into it. I felt isolated, alone. My friends, those who were still in the area, offered support, but they couldn't truly understand the depth of the betrayal. They couldn't grasp the idea that the people who shared my blood, my childhood, would turn on me like this. I remember a conversation with my friend, Ken, who had been my high school buddy. We met for coffee at a local diner, the kind of place with red vinyl booths and chipped formica tables. "I can't believe they're doing this, Marcus," Ken said, stirring his coffee, "after everything you've done for them, for your parents." "They don't see it that way, Ken," I said, my voice hollow. "They see a handout. They see me as someone who had a free ride and now I'm trying to cash in." "That's because they're selfish, man," Ken said, shaking his head. "They didn't want the responsibility, but they want the reward. It's a classic case of all gain, no pain. They feel guilty and this is how they're dealing with it, by turning you into the bad guy." His words resonated. Guilt. It was the driving force behind their cruelty. They couldn't face the truth of their own neglect, so they created a convenient narrative where I was the villain. It was easier to believe I was a manipulator than to admit they had failed their parents. My father was a quiet witness to all this. His mind was still clear enough to understand the gravity of the situation, but his body was failing. He saw the legal papers, the letters from the lawyers, and the strain on my face. One afternoon, he took my hand, his grip surprisingly strong. "Don't let them do this to you, son," he whispered, his eyes filled with a pain that wasn't just physical. "Your mother knew what was right. You are her legacy. You are her heart." His words were a lifeline, a desperately needed affirmation. I was fighting not just for the money, but for my mother's memory, for the integrity of the promise I had kept. I was fighting for my dignity. The first official letter from their lawyer arrived a week later. It was a formal notification that they were contesting the will on grounds of undue influence and diminished capacity of the testator. It was a cold, bureaucratic document that stripped my life's work down to a malicious act. It painted a picture of a man who preyed on his vulnerable mother, who isolated her from her other children and manipulated her into rewriting her will. The lies were so brazen, so confident, they almost felt real. The letter also requested a formal mediation to discuss a fairer distribution of assets, a thinly veiled attempt to force me to give up a large portion of my inheritance without a lengthy court battle. It was a calculated move, a test of my resolve. I called Mr. Harrison and read the letter to him. "They're bluffing, Marcus," he said, his voice calm. "This is a scare tactic. They know a court case will be long, expensive, and they will likely lose. They're hoping you'll settle just to avoid the fight." "And what if I don't?" I asked. "Then we go to court," he said, the tone in his voice becoming serious. "And we prove to a judge and jury that you are who your mother said you were, a devoted son, not a caretaker, not a fraud, and we will win." His confidence was a small anchor in the storm, but the thought of a public trial, of having my life dissected and my character assassinated in a courtroom, was a terrifying prospect. My quiet private existence was about to be thrust into the brutal spotlight of a legal battle. The weight was back, not just the physical weight of groceries, but the suffocating weight of my siblings' lies, the burden of proof, the emotional strain of fighting people I once loved. I knew this was just the beginning. The first salvo had been fired. The war for my inheritance, and more importantly, my dignity, was now in full swing. The doorbell rang at an ungodly hour, a jarring sound in the quiet morning. I looked through the peephole and saw a face I hadn't seen in over 2 decades. It was Mark, my brother-in-law, Sarah's husband. His presence here, without Sarah, was a surprise. He stood on the porch, his shoulders hunched, a tired look in his eyes. I opened the door, a wave of caution washing over me. "Mark, what are you doing here?" He offered a weak smile. "Just wanted to talk, Marcus. Sarah doesn't know I'm here. It's complicated." I let him in. The last time he had been here was for a holiday dinner years ago, before my parents' health had declined. He had always been the quiet one, a man who preferred to observe rather than participate in the family's drama. He sat on a chair, the same one my father used to read his newspaper in, and he sighed heavily. "I need to be honest with you," he began, his voice low. "Sarah is spiraling. This inheritance thing, it's all she talks about. She's convinced you're a thief, that you cheated her and David out of what's theirs." "I didn't cheat anyone, Mark," I said, a defensive edge to my voice. "My mother left me what she wanted to. It was her will, not mine." "I know that," he said, looking at me directly. "I've seen the will, Marcus, I've read it. And I've read the letters from Mr. Harrison. He's right. This thing is solid. Sarah and David don't have a case." A flicker of hope lit up inside me. "Then why are they doing this?" "Guilt," he said simply. "They can't admit they abandoned your parents. It's a moral failure they can't live with. So, they've created a narrative where you're the villain. It's easier to be angry at you than it is to be disappointed in themselves." I nodded slowly. Ken had said the same thing, but hearing it from someone inside the enemy camp felt different. It felt like a confirmation, a truth I had always suspected but was afraid to acknowledge. "And now they've hired these shark lawyers," he continued. "They're spending a fortune trying to find some loophole, some flaw in your mother's will. They're going to drag this through the mud, Marcus. They're going to dig into your life, your past. They'll try to find anything they can use against you." My heart sank. The idea of having my life, every detail, every decision, scrutinized by hostile lawyers was a chilling prospect. "What are they looking for?" I asked, my voice barely a whisper. "They're looking for any instance where you might have discussed the will with your mother. They're going to try to prove you isolated her, that you convinced her to change her mind. They're going to attack your character, Marcus. They'll paint you as a failed son who took advantage of his mother's kindness." The words stung, but I knew they were true. This wasn't just a legal battle, it was a character assassination. It was a fight to prove who I was, not just what I deserved. "Why are you telling me this, Mark?" I asked, looking at him carefully. He hesitated, a deep sadness in his eyes. "Because I've seen what this is doing to Sarah. It's consuming her. And because I think you deserve to know what's coming. You're a good man, Marcus. You were here for my mother-in-law when no one else was. I respect that. And I don't want to see this family destroyed over something that could have been handled with a little bit of grace." "There's no grace left, Mark," I said, a bitter taste in my mouth. "There's only war." He nodded sadly. "I know. Just be careful. They're playing dirty. And they're going to get even dirtier." He stood up, ready to leave. "One more thing," he said, turning back to me. "They've been talking to your dad, trying to get him to say things, to admit things, to claim he was also manipulated." A jolt of fear shot through me. My father, frail and vulnerable, was now a target. My own family, my own blood, was trying to use my dying father against me. The betrayal was so complete, so monstrous I could barely comprehend it. "He's been so confused," I said, my voice shaking. "He would never lie." "He might not have to," Mark said grimly. "They're twisting his words, putting pressure on him. They're desperate, Marcus. Desperate people do desperate things." I walked him to the door, my mind a storm of anxiety and rage. The brief moment of hope I had felt from his visit was now replaced by a chilling new reality. They weren't just after my money, they were after my father's memory, my mother's legacy, and my own sanity. I had to protect my father, to shield him from their venomous lies. The fight was no longer just for my inheritance, it was for the last shred of my family's honor. I closed the door behind Mark, the sound of the latch clicking into place echoing through the quiet house. The war had just gotten a lot more personal. The battlefield was no longer in a lawyer's office, it was in the heart of my own home. And I had to fight not just for myself, but for the man who had always been my silent anchor, my father. The next few days were a blur of protective measures. I informed Mr. Harrison about my brother-in-law's visit and the new threat, my father. He immediately advised me to limit my father's contact with Sarah and David, and to keep a clear record of every interaction. We had to prove that my father was not a willing participant in their scheme, that he was being exploited. I felt a new kind of anger, one that was deeper and more potent than before. They had crossed a line. My parents were not just assets to be divided. They were people, and their memories deserved respect. Using my father's vulnerability against me was a new low, a level of cruelty I hadn't thought my siblings were capable of. I called my sister Sarah, determined to confront her. "How could you?" I said, my voice shaking with a cold fury. "How could you use Dad like this? He's not well, he's confused. How can you put him through that?" Sarah's voice was sharp, devoid of any remorse. "We're not using him, Marcus. We're just trying to get the truth. We're asking him what really happened. He deserves to know that you might have taken advantage of Mom." "He knows the truth," I roared into the phone. "He knows what happened. He was here. He saw me. He saw you. You abandoned them. You didn't even call. And now you're trying to twist his mind with your lies for some money?" "It's not about the money, Marcus," she shot back, her voice rising. "It's about what's fair. We are all her children. We all deserve an equal share of her legacy. You were just a caretaker. You weren't a partner in her life like we were." "A partner?" I scoffed, a bitter laugh escaping my lips. "What kind of partner leaves their partner to do all the work? I was the partner who stayed. You were the ones who left. The only legacy you're fighting for is a monetary one. I'm fighting for the legacy of a promise, a bond, and a life I gave to our parents." She hung up on me. The conversation left me trembling with rage and sadness. My words had no effect on her. Her mind was already made up, her narrative firmly in place. It was a brick wall of self-justification, and I was just a voice on the other side, an inconvenience to her greed. A few days later, a second letter arrived from their lawyers. It was a formal deposition request, and the list of people they wanted to interview was long and invasive. My father's doctors, the nurses who had helped us, my mother's old business partners, even a few of my friends. They were casting a wide net, hoping to find a single person who would say I had manipulated my mother or isolated her. I sat with Mr. Harrison, going over the list. "This is a fishing expedition, Marcus," he said, his face grim. "They're hoping to intimidate everyone, to make them afraid to speak on your behalf." "What about the nurses?" I asked. "What if they say something that could be taken out of context?" "We'll prepare them," Mr. Harrison said. "We'll brief them on what to expect. We'll make it clear that they are witnesses to the facts, not to your siblings' fantasies." The nurses, thankfully, were on my side. They had seen firsthand the level of care I provided. They saw the late nights, the emotional exhaustion, the endless compassion I had for my parents. They were my strongest allies, and they were ready to testify on my behalf. But there was another name on the list that sent a chill down my spine. It was a name from my past, a woman I hadn't spoken to in over 30 years, Susan. Susan and I had been a couple in college. We had a serious, long-term relationship, and we had even talked about getting married. But our dreams had been different. I had always wanted a quiet life, a family, a small business. She had wanted to travel the world, to work for a non-profit, to make a difference on a grand scale. We had drifted apart, but there had been no animosity, just a quiet understanding that our paths were different. My siblings' lawyers had somehow found her. The thought of them reaching out to a woman from my distant past, of her being dragged into this mess, made me sick to my stomach. I had to reach out to her first, to warn her. I found her number in an old address book and called, my heart pounding in my chest. I expected to get a wrong number, but she answered on the third ring, her voice the same melodic, kind sound I remembered. "Susan, it's Marcus Vance." There was a long pause on the other end. "Marcus, I can't believe it's you. It's been so long." "I know," I said, my voice thick with emotion. "I'm sorry to call you like this, but my family is in the middle of a lawsuit. It's about my mother's will. They're trying to contest it, and their lawyers are trying to contact you." "They already did," she said, her voice dropping. "They called me yesterday. They asked about our relationship, about our breakup, about my opinions on your life choices. It was bizarre." "What did you tell them?" I asked, my heart in my throat. "I told them the truth, Marcus," she said, her voice firm. "I told them we broke up because our dreams were different. And I told them what I remembered about your family, about how you were always the one who put them first, even back then. I told them you were a good person, and that you were the one who always had your parents' best interests at heart." A wave of relief washed over me. "Thank you, Susan. Thank you so much." Don't thank me, Marcus. I was just telling the truth, and I'm sorry to hear what you're going through. It sounds terrible. We talked for a while longer, a brief reunion after a lifetime apart. As we said goodbye, I felt a sense of clarity. The deception of my siblings was immense, but so was the truth. It was a stark contrast between their selfishness and the kindness of people who truly knew me. Their lies were elaborate, but my life was a testament to the truth, and I was going to fight to make sure that truth was heard. The war was getting uglier, but I was not alone. The quiet support of people who knew my character was the strength I needed to face the battles to come. The legal battle escalated, and the personal attacks became more vicious. It wasn't just my siblings' lawyers anymore, it was the public. A local news station had picked up on the story, a high-profile inheritance dispute involving a prominent family. The headlines were sensationalized and cruel. Family feud, son accused of manipulating dying matriarch for fortune. The articles were filled with twisted truths and outright lies, portraying me as a scheming opportunist who had lived off my parents' wealth while his hard-working siblings built their own lives. They quoted an unnamed family source, obviously Sarah or David, who claimed I had isolated my parents and pressured my mother into rewriting her will. The public scrutiny was a new kind of hell. Strangers on the street would give me suspicious looks. The cashier at the grocery store, a woman I had known for years, seemed to avoid eye contact. My quiet, anonymous life was gone, replaced by a caricature in the media. I sat with Mr. Harrison, his face a mask of controlled anger, as he read a particularly malicious article. "This is a coordinated smear campaign, Marcus," he said, slamming the paper down on his desk. "They're trying to win the public's opinion before we even get to a courtroom. It's a disgusting tactic, but it's not illegal, it's just morally bankrupt." "What can we do?" I asked, my voice raw with frustration. "They're turning me into a monster." "We can't respond publicly," he said. "That's what they want. They want a public spectacle, a war of words. We have to be the bigger person. We have to stay silent and let the legal process work. The facts are on our side." But the facts felt so distant, so abstract, when my daily life was being torn apart. I found myself becoming withdrawn, avoiding phone calls and keeping to myself. My friends, bless them, tried to support me. Ken would call every day just to check in. "Don't let them get to you, man." People who know you know the truth. The most painful part of it all was my father. He was confused by the headlines, by the visits from lawyers, and by the absence of his other children. He would ask me, his eyes clouded with worry, "What's wrong, son? Why are they saying these things?" It broke my heart to have to explain, to have to shield him from the ugliness of his own children's greed. "It's nothing, Dad," I would say, a lie I repeated often. "It's just a misunderstanding. We'll fix it." One afternoon he was watching the news, and a segment about the lawsuit came on. The reporter, a slick-haired man in a fancy suit, stood in front of our house, a microphone in his hand. He was painting a picture of a broken family and a suspicious inheritance. My father looked at the screen, then at me, his eyes filled with a heartbreaking clarity. "They're trying to hurt you, aren't they?" he whispered. I couldn't lie to him anymore. I sat next to him and took his hand. "Yes, Dad, they are." "Why?" he asked, a single tear rolling down his cheek. "Why are they so angry?" "Because they're disappointed in themselves," I said, the truth finally tumbling out. "They're angry at their own choices, and they're blaming me for their guilt." He was silent for a long moment, his grip on my hand tightening. "Your mother knew," he said, his voice stronger than I had heard in a long time. "She knew what you did for us. She knew the love in your heart. You are not just a caretaker, Marcus. You are our son, and that's worth more than all the money in the world." His words were a balm to my wounded soul. My father, in his frailty, was my rock. He was the one who saw me, who truly understood my sacrifice. His love and belief in me were the only things that mattered. A few days later, I received a call from a number I didn't recognize. It was my mother's former business partner, a woman named Carol. I had met her a few times at family functions, and she had always been kind. "Marcus," she said, her voice firm and no nonsense, I've been reading these horrible stories in the paper. It's absolutely ridiculous." "Thank you, Carol," I said, my voice thick with emotion. "Don't thank me. I just wanted to tell you that I've been in touch with Mr. Harrison. I've told him everything. About how your mother trusted you implicitly. About how she spoke of you constantly. About how she saw you as the only one who truly understood her. I've told him about the letters and emails she sent me, detailing her love and respect for you. She was a shrewd woman, Marcus. She knew exactly what she was doing. She wanted to make sure you were taken care of." Her words were another piece of the puzzle, a testament to my mother's love and foresight. My siblings were trying to paint a picture of a manipulated, confused old woman. But my mother was a powerful businesswoman who knew exactly what she was doing. She was a mother who saw her son's sacrifice and wanted to honor it. The media storm continued, but I felt a new sense of resolve. The weight was still there, but it was no longer a burden of shame. It was a weight of truth, of honor, of dignity. My siblings could throw all the lies they wanted, but I had a growing army of truth-tellers on my side. I was ready for the next battle, and I was going to win. Not for the money, but for my parents, for the promise I had kept, and for the son who refused to be defined by his siblings' lies. The day of the deposition arrived. I sat in a conference room at Mr. Harrison's office, the atmosphere thick with tension. Across the long mahogany table, Sarah and David sat with their lawyers, a sharp, intimidating team of men and women in tailored suits. They were the kind of people who looked at a person and saw only a case file, not a human being. Their lead attorney, a man named Sterling, had a cold, calculating look in his eyes. He was the one who had orchestrated the media attacks, and I recognized his work. He was a master of manipulation, and I was about to be his next target. "Mr. Vance," Sterling began, his voice smooth and condescending, "let's start at the beginning. You quit your job approximately 10 years ago, is that correct?" "That's correct," I said, my voice steady. "And you did so to move in with your parents and care for them?" "That's right. And during that time you were not compensated for your work as a caretaker." I bristled at the word. I wasn't a caretaker. I was a son. And I wasn't compensated. I was doing my duty. "Your duty?" Sterling's eyebrows raised in mock surprise. "Is it your duty to live off your parents' wealth while your siblings are working hard to provide for their own families?" "I lived in my family home," I said, keeping my tone even. "And I took care of my parents' every need. I was their cook, their driver, their companion, their nurse, and their confidant. A job, I might add, that you would have to pay a team of professionals for." Sterling's expression soured. He was used to people crumbling under his questioning. "And when did your mother begin showing signs of cognitive decline?" "About 5 years ago," I said. "She was diagnosed with Alzheimer's. And during this period of her vulnerability, did you ever discuss her will with her?" "No," I said, a little too quickly. "I never brought it up." "So you're saying that the idea of leaving you the majority of her estate came solely from her?" "Yes." Sterling smiled a cruel, knowing smile. "That seems a little convenient, doesn't it? That she would just, out of the blue, decide to leave everything to the one son who lived off her and wasn't working." "That's what you want us to believe, isn't it?" My heart pounded in my chest. He was trying to get me to lose my temper, to say something that could be used against me. I took a deep breath, recalling the strength of my father's words. "What I want you to believe," I said, my voice firm and clear, "is the truth. My mother was a brilliant businesswoman, and she knew exactly what she was doing. She saw my sacrifice, my loyalty, my love. She saw that while her other children were living their own lives, I was living her life with her. She valued that. And this," I said, gesturing to the will, "is her way of honoring that." Sterling's face went from smug to a cold, hard anger. He was not used to being challenged. "I have a witness who will say otherwise, Mr. Vance. A witness who will say you pressured your mother into this decision." I looked at Sarah and David. Their faces were impassive, but I could see the glint of triumph in their eyes. They thought they had me. "And who would that be?" I asked. Sterling leaned back in his chair, a theatrical gesture. "Your own father." My blood ran cold. The betrayal was complete. They had found a way to manipulate my father, to twist his words, to turn him against me. I felt a wave of nausea. "My father is not of sound mind," I said, my voice shaking. "You know that. You are taking advantage of a sick man." "So a judge will decide that, Mr. Vance," Sterling said, his voice dripping with condescension. "And a judge will decide if you, a man who has not worked in 10 years, are a fit person to handle a multi-million-dollar estate." The accusation hung in the air. For a moment I felt defeated. They had a point. My life had been defined by my parents' needs, not my own. I had no career, no ambition, no legacy of my own. I was just a man who had cared for his parents. Then I looked at Mr. Harrison. He gave me a small, almost imperceptible nod, a signal. He believed in me. I looked at the framed picture of my parents on my desk, a picture I had brought with me for strength. They were smiling, their faces full of love. I remembered my father's words. "You are our son, and that's worth more than all the money in the world." I looked at Sterling, at Sarah, at David. They saw me as a caretaker, as a leech, as a failure. But my parents saw me as a son, and that was all that mattered. "Let me ask you a question, Mr. Sterling," I said, my voice now calm and clear. "If my mother had left me nothing and had instead given everything to my siblings, would you be questioning her judgment? Would you be accusing them of undue influence? Or would you be praising her for her wisdom?" Sterling was momentarily speechless. He had no answer. My question had exposed the hypocrisy at the heart of their case. This wasn't about my mother's mental state. It was about their greed. The deposition ended a few hours later, with both sides exhausted. I walked out of the conference room feeling drained, but also a little bit victorious. They had tried to break me, but I had held my own. They had tried to shame me for my life, but I had found a new strength in my own truth. The battle was far from over, but for the first time, I knew I had a chance to win. I wasn't just fighting for an inheritance. I was fighting for my dignity, for my life, for my parents' honor. And I would not back down. The weeks following the deposition were a testament to the power of truth. My siblings' attempt to use my father against me had backfired. Mr. Harrison, with the help of a psychologist specializing in elder care, was able to prove that my father's statements were inconsistent and likely a result of external pressure. The psychologist's report was damning, detailing the manipulation my siblings had engaged in. It was a formal accusation of elder abuse, a legal weapon we were now prepared to use. The public perception also began to shift. The media, which had been so quick to condemn me, was now reporting on the new developments. The headlines were now more balanced, even sympathetic. Legal experts questioned families' tactics in inheritance dispute, and son fighting back against allegations of elder abuse. My mother's former business partner, Carol, had come forward with more than just verbal support. She provided a trove of documents, letters, emails, and even video recordings of my mother in the final months of her life. The videos were particularly powerful. They showed my mother, though frail, still sharp and lucid. In one video, she was sitting in the garden, her hand in mine, and she was speaking directly to the camera. "If anything were to happen to me," she said, her voice a little shaky but her eyes clear, "I want the world to know that Marcus is not just my son, he is my best friend. He is the only one who has ever been here for me, for us. And I want to make sure he is taken care of, that he is compensated for his years of sacrifice. This is not a matter of charity, it is a matter of justice." The video was a gift from a mother to her son, a final act of love and protection. It was a testament to her sanity, her foresight, and her unwavering trust in me. It was the key to our case, the evidence that would blow my siblings' accusations out of the water. My father's health was fading fast, but his mind was still clear enough to understand that the tide had turned. He would often ask me to sit with him, and we would talk about the old days, about my mother, about the family we used to be. "I'm sorry, son," he would say, his voice a soft whisper, "for all of this." "It's not your fault, Dad," I would say, holding his hand. "This is not your fault. I just wanted to make peace," he would say, tears welling up in his eyes. "But there is no peace with greed. There is only a fight." His words were a hard truth, a lesson learned too late. He had always been the peacemaker in our family, the one who tried to hold everything together. Now, he was watching it all fall apart, a final sad chapter in his life. The next legal step was a mandatory mediation session, a last-ditch effort to settle the case before it went to a public trial. Mr. Harrison told me it was a formality, but I knew it was a chance for one last confrontation with Sarah and David. We met in a neutral conference room with a mediator, a stern, unsmiling woman sitting between us. Sarah and David looked exhausted, their faces pale and their eyes tired. The legal fees were mounting, and the media attention had taken its toll on their careers and their families. They were no longer the confident, smug people from the last deposition. They were losing, and they knew it. The mediator began by laying out the case, the mountain of evidence we had against them, the damning psychological report, the video testimony of my mother. She presented the evidence with a cold, detached professionalism, as if she were reading from a script. As she spoke, I watched my siblings' faces. The masks of anger and entitlement were gone, replaced by a quiet, gnawing fear. They were no longer fighting for what they believed was theirs. They were fighting to avoid humiliation, to save face. When it was their turn to speak, Sarah's lawyer, Sterling, stood up. He tried to argue, to poke holes in our evidence, but his voice lacked its usual confidence. The facts were simply too overwhelming. He was a professional liar, and now he was faced with an undeniable truth. Finally, the mediator turned to me. "Marcus, what is it that you want?" I looked at Sarah and David. I saw the people they once were, the people I had shared a childhood with, the people who were now strangers. The anger was still there, but it was now overshadowed by a deep, profound sadness. This wasn't a victory. It was a tragedy. "I want them to admit the truth," I said, my voice trembling with emotion. "I want them to admit that they were not there for our parents. I want them to admit that they are doing this out of greed and guilt, not out of a sense of justice. And I want them to stop. I want them to leave me and my father alone, and I want them to apologize, to me and to my father, for what they have put us through." The room was silent. The mediator looked at my siblings. "Do you have a response?" she asked. Sarah's face crumpled. She looked at me, a flash of something in her eyes that was not anger, not greed, but something I hadn't seen in years. Shame. We can't apologize," she said, her voice a whisper. "We can't admit it. It would destroy us." "You already did that when you chose to do this," I said, my voice filled with a final quiet resignation. "You destroyed our family a long time ago. Now you're just trying to bury the evidence." The mediation ended without a resolution. It was a failure on paper, but a victory for me. They would not apologize, they would not admit their guilt, but I had forced them to look at the truth. They had lost the battle for my inheritance, but they had also lost the battle for their own souls. The war would continue, but I knew with a chilling certainty that I had already won. The truth was my weapon, and it was more powerful than all their lies. The court case began 3 weeks later. The courtroom was a grand, imposing space, a solemn theater of justice. The press was there, a line of reporters with notebooks and cameras ready to broadcast the spectacle. I sat at the plaintiff's table, my father, now in a wheelchair and much frailer, by my side. Mr. Harrison and his team were a wall of support. On the other side of the room, Sarah and David sat, looking small and defeated, their lawyers a shield of professional indifference. The trial was a slow, deliberate dissection of my life. My daily routine, my parents' medical history, the details of my mother's will, all of it was laid bare. Sterling, Sarah and David's lawyer, was relentless in his cross-examination. He tried to paint me as a man who had lived a life of leisure, an opportunist who had seen his chance to strike it rich. "Mr. Vance," Sterling said, his voice a low, hostile drone, "is it not true that you had no income for 10 years? "That is true," I said, my voice steady. "And is it not true that you had no financial responsibilities for that time?" "That is not true," I said, looking him in the eye. "I was responsible for my parents' lives, their food, their medication, their doctor's appointments, their happiness. I was responsible for their dignity." Sterling sneered. And now you want to be responsible for their money. I want my mother's wishes to be honored, I said, my voice a whisper. That is all. The trial dragged on. We presented our evidence, the detailed records of my care, the testimony of the nurses who had seen me every day, and the damning psychological report on my father's manipulation. Then it was time for the video testimony. Mr. Harrison had prepared the court for it, but the impact was still immense. The video was played on a large screen, the image of my mother filling the room. Her face, a little tired but still beautiful, her eyes filled with a love that transcended the years. "My son Marcus," she said, her voice echoing through the silent courtroom. "He is the heart of this family. He has given his life for us. He has been our rock. And if my other children choose to dispute this," her eyes turned to the camera, and it felt as if she were looking directly at Sarah and David, "I want them to know that this is not a reward. This is a testament to a love they were not willing to give, a testament to a son who gave everything, and a mother who wants to make sure he has something left for himself." The video ended. The courtroom was silent. Even the reporters had put down their pens. The air was thick with emotion. I looked at Sarah and David. Sarah was crying, a single tear tracing a path down her cheek. David's face was a mask of cold fury, but I could see the tremor in his hands. My mother's words had cut through all their lies, all their legal jargon, all their carefully constructed narratives. They had no defense against her love. The defense rested, and the jury went into deliberation. It was a long, agonizing wait. My father, who had been so strong, was now quiet, his eyes closed, his hand holding mine. He was a silent prayer, a silent wish. A few hours later, the jury returned. The foreman stood up, and the judge asked the question, "Have you reached a verdict?" "Yes, Your Honor," the foreman said. "And what is your verdict?" "We find in favor of the plaintiff, Marcus Vance." A collective gasp went through the courtroom. I felt a wave of relief so powerful I thought I would collapse. I squeezed my father's hand. He opened his eyes, a small, tired smile on his face. He had heard. He knew we had won. The room was a blur of activity. Mr. Harrison was shaking my hand. The reporters were rushing to get their stories, and Sarah and David were talking in hushed, angry tones to their lawyers. I stood up and walked over to them. They looked at me with a mixture of resentment and resignation. "We will appeal," David said, his voice hoarse with rage. "This is not over." "It is, David," I said, my voice soft. "It's over. You lost. You lost the money. You lost the family. And you lost your dignity." I looked at Sarah. She was still crying, her face a mess. "I'm sorry, Marcus," she whispered, her voice barely audible. I just wanted to be a part of it." "You were a part of it, Sarah," I said, my voice thick with emotion. "You were just never here. That's the difference." I turned and walked away. I didn't feel victorious. I felt a profound sense of sadness. The inheritance was just a thing, a symbol of a love I already had. The real tragedy was the family I had lost, the family that was now gone, replaced by strangers who looked at me with hatred. I walked out of the courtroom, my father by my side. The reporters were a swarm of buzzing flies, but I ignored them. I looked at my father, and I saw a man who had been through so much, and now he was at peace. The weight was finally gone. I was not a caretaker, not a fraud, not a failure. I was a son, and that was all I had ever wanted to be. The days that followed the trial were a quiet, mournful return to my old life. The house, once a battlefield, was now a silent monument to the past. The media moved on to the next sensational story, and the phone calls from lawyers stopped. The only calls I received were from Ken and Susan, who offered their quiet, steadfast support. My father's health continued to decline. He was at peace, but his body was failing. He was no longer a witness to the family drama. He was a silent, gentle presence, a quiet anchor in the storm of my life. One afternoon, he looked at me, his eyes clear and lucid for a moment. "You won, son," he whispered. "You won." "We won, Dad," I said, squeezing his hand. "We won." "Your mother would be proud," he said. a small, tired smile on his face. She would be so proud. He passed away in his sleep a few days later, a peaceful end to a life of quiet dignity. The funeral was small and private, just a few close friends. Sarah and David didn't come. They had sent a text message with their condolences, a hollow gesture that I didn't bother to reply to. After the funeral, I was alone in the house. It was the first time in 10 years I was truly alone. The silence was deafening. The memories, once so vivid, were now ghosts, and I was the only one left to remember them. I spent the next few months slowly rebuilding my life. I hired a team of professionals to manage the estate, the businesses, and the properties. My mother had built a legacy, and I was determined to honor it. I also started working with a local charity, one that provided care for elderly people in need. It was a way to continue the work I had been doing for so long, but on my own terms. I kept the house. It was a part of me, a part of my story. I walked through the rooms, the familiar scent of lavender still lingering in the air. I looked at the picture of my parents on the mantelpiece, and I spoke to them, a quiet, one-sided conversation. "I did it," I whispered. "I kept the promise. I had won the legal battle, but I had lost my family. The inheritance was a huge sum of money, but it couldn't buy back the years I had lost, the relationships I had sacrificed, or the family I once had." One evening, I was sitting on the porch, the same porch where my father and I had sat so many times. The sun was setting, painting the sky in a blaze of orange and purple. The air was crisp, carrying the scent of fall. I felt a profound sense of peace. I had fought for my dignity, and I had won. I had honored my parents, and I had kept my word. I was no longer just a caretaker. I was no longer defined by my past or by my siblings' lies. I was a man who had loved his parents, who had done his duty, and who had found a new life on the other side of a bitter war. The last promise had been kept, and now for the first time in a very long time, I was ready to make a promise to myself. To live, to find my own happiness, to build a new life, a new legacy, a new story. And as I watched the sun dip below the horizon, I knew, with a quiet certainty, that my story was just beginning.